Hi, I'm Ryan. I'm a woodworker running a small business out of my little one-car garage here. Today I'm going to walk you through how I make perfect miter joints for furniture I'm working on. I'm going to teach you a couple tips and tricks and a few things you should know. Miter joints on the surface are pretty easy, but they demand a level of perfection that's sometimes hard to hit. So watch along, I'll show you what I do. I hope you enjoy. Okay, so miter joints are easy, right? You just take your wood, hop over to the miter saw, wham, bam, chop, slop, everything's good. You just get the joint done, get the cut done, and everything lines up, right? Well, that's not my experience. I find miter joints at the miter saw hard to get unless you're, working with a 2x4 or something really small. For big panels, they're no good. I've used my track saw in the past, which can work in a pinch, but maybe it's just me, haven't found a good way to lock in the calibration or the accuracy of my track saw, and I find there's just a little bit of wibble to it. I have a Milwaukee track saw. Some of my tracks allow me to lock the saw in so it doesn't tip over. Some of them don't. I've got a mix of different tracks. I find, without a doubt, the best way to cut a miter is on the table saw. I like to use my Incra Miter Express for this. Sometimes, depending on the shape and dimensions, I will just kind of freehand it through, but generally seem to get the best results if I have a surface I can clamp down to, lock it down. You could use this with a more expensive miter gauge. You could do this with a homemade crosscut sled. There's a bunch of different ways. You could use a fence and a stop block. The biggest thing you want to make sure of is if you're pushing a big piece of wood through like this and you're cross-cutting it, don't freehand it. You'll probably kill yourself, and then, you'll have a messy piece of wood with a bad miter. So don't do that. It wouldn't make sense. So I'm making a solid cherry nightstand. The top of the nightstand is just basically a mitered box with rounded over edges. So I have this long piece here which I glued up. It was 4/4, milled it down to about 3/4 of an inch, just a hair over. Went through the process, got it all ready to go. I've completely sanded it, so finished sanding, knowing I'll have to come back and touch it up a little bit, and I've rounded over the edge. The only thing I haven't done is cut the dado in the back for the back panel, and I'll do that after the miters are cut. But I like to get it as close to ready as I can before I start cutting the miters. For this one, I glued it up in one long piece because I want the grain to match on the three sides that you can see. I want it to wrap around. If you were making a box and you wanted to wrap it on four sides, you got to go about it a little bit differently. You basically have to take a thicker piece of wood, resaw it, and wrap it around. I'm just using another panel here for the bottom. The grain doesn't need to match on this because you can't see it. It's going to have legs attached. It's going to be underneath. So I didn't have to worry about that. I just wanted to make sure that I had the three sides that'll be visible when it's installed in its resting place in the client's bedroom, able to be fully grain matched. Okay, so I did say I wasn't going to use my track saw, but that's to cut the miters. What I'm going to do is I'm going to cut these into the respective chunks at the full size. So because you're mitering off the bottom angle, you can cut this to the full outside dimension and you'll be right there. So the inside of a miter is obviously shorter than the outside. I know that for this piece, I want the dimensions to be 24 inches wide at the top on the outside and 15 1/4 inches high. So I can cut my pieces to 15 1/4, 24, 15 1/4. So I'm going to lay that out, and I am going to cut it with the track saw. I could cut this on my table saw without a problem, just clamp it down to my sled, no worries. But the blade on my track saw has a narrower kerf, and the narrower the kerf, the less material you lose, and the tighter that joint will be from kind of a grain wrap perspective. If I wasn't worried about grain wrapping this, I'd probably just throw it on the table saw and cut it. I mean, it is a little bit long and unwieldy. The track saw works fine. Either way, no issues. You just need to cross cut this. Okay, so with this last one here, I just caught myself here. I was about to cut it, but because this one side is going to connect to the bottom and it's not grain wrapped, I'm going to leave this piece a little bit long. The important piece with miters to get them super tight and to get a nice square box is to make sure that each piece is exactly the same length. So if I leave this one a little bit long, like we're not talking much, maybe 1/8 of an inch or, you know, 1/4 of an inch long, again, because this side isn't going to grain wrap, it doesn't matter. Then when I cut it down using a stop block on the miter saw to cut the miters, Bob's your uncle, you just slice it, be the perfect length, and we're off to the races. You just gotta make sure that I don't cut the extra off on the good side. Okay, so I got the pieces done. Here's our off cut. We'll move that out of the way. You can see here, here's my line. So we left, like I said, that one about 1/4 of an inch long, 1/2 an inch long. We'll deal with that in a minute. So right side. So now we need to label this B and B, because we know those guys go together. Okay, now that we've got our pieces cut, let's move over to setting up the table saw. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, there's a few things I want to go over with setting up the table saw. So the first thing is I'm using a Incra Mitre Express. It is a Incra Mitre 1000 SE, like a decent quality miter gauge. You can always use the one that comes with your saw, but I lost the little like thing that locks it down, so this is not much good to me. So yeah, for today we'll be using the Incra gauge kind of sled combo. You can use your fence if you use a stop block and you keep the material away from it as it's passing the blade for these kind of more wider, skinnier cross cuts. You can use just the gauge itself and push it through, that's all fine. Again, I prefer this. I find that for accuracy of cuts, a stop block on this is essential. I have this kind of brand new sacrificial fence here that is a pretty important piece to this process, and we'll get to that in a second. It's ready to go. The way the Incra works has this little offcut piece here, and you just push it through and it supports the material. Okay, there's a few different ways to set up your blade here to get it at the right angle. You can use the square. You can use one of these little electric angle finder gauges. But what you really shouldn't do is trust this. Now, I find this a pretty reasonable interpretation of getting somewhat close to where you need to be. But when making furniture, we're making things that are fairly decorative and you want pretty good miters. Don't just hit 45 and hope for the best. If you're going to use one of these digital gauges, the best thing to do is to put it on kind of the flat part of your table saw, zero it out, and then move it over to the blade. So you can see here we're just under, and when cutting miters, being just under is the worst place to be. When you're just under, you end up with a miter that is open at the outside edge and tight on the inside, which when you're making furniture is not at all what you want, because that's the most visible side of it. And when you have a miter that's tight on the outside, even if it is just a hair open on the inside, it'll usually pull together, it'll usually be kind of invisible. I like to shoot for bang on or just a hair over. So if we crank on this wheel a little bit more. Okay, so you can see here we're now right at 45. It's where we want to be. Now you see if we take this square, we're just a hair over at the top. So these guys aren't agreeing. So if we crank this down a little bit more, tighten up, and you can see on the gauge here, we're 44.8, but we're tight on here. We're very close. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split the difference. I'm going to go 44.9. I'll lock this down. Okay, now we're going to make some test cuts. This step isn't strictly necessary, but if you want the perfect miter, it's best to just use a piece of scrap. We have this cut off here from making these panels. We're going to just cut a couple miters and see how they come together. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to use here is my digital angle finder. We'll just see what this shows. So there you have it. Bang on, first try, 45 degrees. I'm going to cut just a second one here off of this and bring them together and make sure they look okay, but I'm pretty confident. But you know, it never hurts to just triple check. Okay, you can see here there's just a whisker of a gap there when we bring them together, but let's see how this works out. Et voila. We have here a perfect miter. It's kind of interesting how you get those little gaps there, hey, but when you pull them together. So I think we're good on the test piece. Let's move on to cutting the real miters. Yeah, so you can see these are even way better than the sample piece. Quite a bit tighter, those will pull together very nice. Left side. Bob is my uncle. Right on, well, pretty good. I find these band clamps pretty helpful for clamping up corners. I'm just gonna dry fit this real quick. I still have to cut the dados in the back for the back panel. I'll spare you from that. I often use dominoes in the corners, but I'm not going to for this because it's just not necessary. I'm building a bench that I'll be gluing up probably later today. And that will definitely get dominoes just because of the added strength necessary for a piece that somebody's sitting on. Okay, here we are for a dry fit. It looks pretty good. It's not perfectly aligned, but that's just, like I said, because it's dry fit, I think this is gonna come together really well. Okay, so I got the dados cut, so we're ready to go here. So to glue these up, I just lay them up with the mitered parts facing down, the mitered joints facing down. Line them all up here. You can see, I hope you can see, the grain match on this is like pretty close, pretty darn good. So I really want to just work on getting these perfectly lined up. And then I'm going to use some of this fancy yellow frog tape. And just stretch these together. Now you got to be careful when doing this because it's easy to overlap them a bit and you want to keep them flush. If there's little gaps here, they'll close up, they'll tighten up when you get the clamps on them. You get them ready to go. The thing here is to just do your best to keep them in the same plane and the grain lined up, the edges lined up perfectly. I like to pull a little bit just to stretch, put a little bit of stretch in the tape, just kind of helps spring the joint together, but again, being careful not to let it pop out of plane. It's a little bit tricky on my table here because it's not perfectly flat. And I thought I would do it on my table saw, but you know, honestly, this bottom piece, the grain, like, it's not even the same piece as wood, but it's kind of close in some spots. But like I said, you'll never see it, so that's okay too. Now sometimes I'll put a piece along the length of the joint. I'm going to try not to because I want to be able to make sure that I can see them, that they're perfectly lined up when I put the clamps on. But it's also possible this will all fall apart as soon as I try to flip it over to put the glue in. So let's see. Oh, of course. Okay, not too bad. I'm just using Titebond 3 for this, so nothing too special. So I like to put a good amount of glue in these joints, especially because I'm not using splines or anything. but I also don't want them to squeeze out and make a huge, massive mess. The last couple times I've done miters, I've taped the insides of the joints, and I've managed to get a fair amount of tape stuck inside the joint just because I put it too close in. So this time I'm just not. Especially because this is hardwood. If it was plywood, it would be different. This is easy enough to sand out if you need to. But just with this amount of glue, there shouldn't be a ton of squeeze out. We'll do our best here to keep as much glue off the table saw as possible. Okay, moment of truth. Let's fold this thing up and see what happens. Ah, nuts. That's going to be a problem. And there we go, all glued up, nice tight miter. Okay, there you go. I hope you found this interesting. That's how I do miters when I build my furniture. Again, a pretty simple joint, but the details do matter on this one. So yeah, hope you liked it. Hope you enjoyed. If you're interested in how I do continuous grain miters for a box, for resawing and all that, let me know in the comments. I'd love to make a video on that if there's interest. But anyways, hope you enjoyed. Hope you have a great day, and thanks for watching.